and thank you for coming back this afternoon. I saw and noticed that some of you had a drink or two, including the lecturers, by the way. So it's great to have you back this afternoon. Okay, where did I put my... This is my pointer. Sorry for that. Just to briefly recap where we finished up earlier this morning. So I provided you very high level, and for those of you who were not there, high level overview about the elements of operational oceanography, including observations, models, data assimilation, nowcasts, and also I talked a little bit about hindcasts / reanalyses. Just to complete this section, there are two things left, and I'll briefly comment on it. One is forecasting systems, and then products and services, and then we move into applications and benefits. International collaboration, as I said, is pretty much focused on a description, a more detailed description of what you heard earlier this morning about Godae OceanView and what the science team is doing. And then I'll conclude essentially with a few comments around trends and future developments, in other words, challenges, and a summary of lecture 2. Now, moving to forecast systems, it's a tricky thing, again, because there's virtually no single setup for a forecasting system. All forecasting systems are slightly different. And I mentioned earlier different approaches in terms of data assimilation. I mentioned to you different models. And similarly, if once the operational centers have made a decision about the choice of the model, the choice of the data assimilation, the choice of observations, you still then have to figure out the nitty-gritty details in terms of how, once you have basically a certain forecast, but how you basically ingest in a forecasting system the observations. And this is just an example from the system which is run at the Australian Bureau of Meteorology. And basically, and I won't go into any details again, the way basically you draw on past information close to the time of the forecast. And look, this is a date. These are the dates here. So every third day, I think, or daily, but it's a 3-day forecast. But daily, a new forecast is being issued. And so basically you move in this direction. But the point is, you have to draw on past information to a certain extent, and the way you draw on past information and nudge, or not nudge, but constrain the model by those past informations, that's a tricky business, and there's no simple way or no single way the centers are doing it. This is just one example. There are many other examples which I could show you from other forecasting centers. But as you can see here, basically, it's a 3-day window, for instance, here for altimetry, and for SST, and that in itself is a science. And the reason for that is because whenever you assimilate observations in an operational sense, you want to minimize what's called the initialization shock. And so how people do that, you have to talk to those people in the centers who are in charge of it. This is part of data assimilation, but it's also a quite challenging problem. And there are various methods around which basically minimize these kind of initialization shocks. I'm just browsing very quickly through this because I think there's an exercise coming up, and other presenters I'm sure will again cover much more detail than I can cover in my overview here. But this is just a screen dump from the Mikado website, and as you are aware, and as I mentioned earlier, many of the operational centers not just run one single model, but in this case it's the global model from Mikado. Then here is a regional model for the Iberian, Biscay-Irish area, and then another one put up here, which is the biogeochemical one. But please remember what I said earlier, and without trying to criticize any system, the biogeochemical forecasts are still a challenge globally. You can then, of course, go more into the relevant websites and download and or animate, view certain areas, certain regions, certain variables. Again, I'm assuming that that's something you will cover in your exercise in terms of the various systems. As I said, chlorophyll here again shown. This is probably the most abundant, in quotes, variable from the observational side of things because of the satellite information available. And so that's why it's one of the key variables for data assimilation and for basically model improvement in ocean forecasting systems, in this case, the biogeochemistry component of it. I should also mention, and for those of you who are from Europe will be aware of it and who are involved in ocean forecasting, there was in fact last week in Brussels the Copernicus Marine Week. Copernicus, there's a system managed by Mikado, but on behalf of the European operational centers about marine environment monitoring services. So this is basically a compilation of all the systems in Europe, or most of them at least, and subsequent dissemination. It's from my perspective as an outsider and layperson, it's a one-stop shop basically for accessing products, forecasting products, reanalysis products, etc., within the European region. So again, I encourage you to have a look at the website for further details. Now, I was thinking a while if I should include this particular point, but I understand that there will be a presentation later by someone from SOCIP. Is that correct, Jack? So I don't want to steal the thunder, so I'm not going to show any details, but I felt I needed to contrast this system a little bit with the global systems. And we already heard this morning from the officials and also from Joachim about SOCIP. So this is, however, nevertheless quite interesting still, because there are some synergies with other centers and other forecasting efforts. So as we already know, the SOCIP system focuses on the Balearic Islands, but it's a combination of basically an observing system, a forecasting system, and a data processing and dissemination system. And SOCIP tries to basically focus on essentially what many other centers do as well. Doing some good science, that's what we want to do as scientists, but also develop new technologies, in the case of observing systems, for instance. And in the end, we all are accountable if you're not working, or if you are working at an operational center to produce some useful outputs for the benefit of society. I should also acknowledge, which I didn't do previously, that whenever we talk about ocean forecasting, it's not just the traditional physical oceanographers or biogeochemical oceanographers, but forecasting always depends on a large range of skills and capabilities. I mean, this includes, for instance, technicians, you know, in the far remote sense, who basically run observing systems, the IT personnel who are in charge of supercomputers, people who do the quality control. So depending on the scale, it can be and is in some cases, particularly with national centers, a huge effort. So let's not forget, it's not just about us, the scientists, but it's also about all the support staff behind it. In terms of SOCIP, just very briefly, and again, I'm assuming that will be covered in a separate presentation and lecture more specifically. Actually, there are two models. There's a regional model, but then there's also, in the context of hydrodynamics, something very special. And some of you might know this. I was certainly unaware of it until I got basically involved and had a look at the SOCIP product. It's a special, and this is then the lower part here, number 2, prediction system to simulate and forecast hazardous sea level oscillation in the Ciutadella on Mallorca. And I looked it up, and people can correct me if I'm wrong, but this is based on tsunami forcing. So in other words, strong, consistent meteorological forcing, surface pressure, etc. And then can cause sea level rise within a very narrow channel in that island of up to 4 meters. And so that's a very dangerous thing, which can cause damage. I know there are a few nice animations on YouTube. As I said, I don't want to steal the thunder here for those of you who will talk about it, but I encourage you to have a look at it. It's really quite exciting. So that's an application where there's a clear need and a clear demonstration of an ongoing need for forecasts to basically prevent and or reduce at least damage to infrastructure and, of course, human life. And so this is the SOCIP website. Have a look at it, and I think we saw something very similar earlier this morning from Joachim. Now, just as in this case, an example, and I'm using here the UK Met Office's foam system. The Godae OceanView has basically collected and tries to ask the centers to update what I would regard as very short, high-level summaries of forecasting systems. So basically, if you go to Godae OceanView, I'm not sure it's publicly available, but certainly to the Godae OceanView program coordinator, Kirsten Wilmer-Becker, she can help you with that. These are high-level descriptions of all of the systems which are part of Godae OceanView. In this case, the example from the UK Met Office, so you get the model, the resolution, the forcing fields, the assimilation characteristics here, and some additional information. And that's very useful if you just want to get a quick shot or basically snapshot of a forecasting system, then that's a very easy and very convenient way to look at it. Now, in terms of the next sub-point here, products and services, I think I already commented earlier, but it's good to remember that basically most operational oceanography systems run at national weather centers really have a certain process in mind, process in place in the way they disseminate products. And again, I'm using here the Australian example. Some of them, as I mentioned earlier, you can get access to data. Some of them you can look at certain products just via an animation. But it's all, I think, dependent on the specific system you're talking about. But it's also very important to remember that it's sometimes, or very often in fact, not just a single institution, but where multiple institutions in a national effort tackle ocean forecasting. In Australia, again, as an example, it's basically the Bureau of Meteorology, CSIRO as a research agency supporting that effort, and the Australian Navy being a customer, but also a stakeholder. And that's very similar, by the way, to many other centers and other efforts in other countries. In terms of, in terms of the products, it's also important to remind ourselves that it's not just basically a dump of data or a basic release of data and then that's it. And people and users can go to the operational center and download it. That's one way of doing it. But increasingly also, there's another group which is called the Met Ocean Service Provider or intermediate users, whatever you want to call them, who basically draw on the data from the operational centers and add value in some form. Basically interpret the data or do certain analyses which are not done by the centers because it's beyond their scope. So this is another important group, an increasingly important group, which is working, for instance, in Australia with the oil and gas industry, providing very specific services which are drawn or basically which are based on say the products developed and released by a number of operational centers. A high-level picture of this again, and coming back to Copernicus, is the way this is handled here in Europe. So basically, you have a whole range of input data from data servers, satellite, in-situ networks, etc., and other sources. Then what they call, and I hope I'm right, the core services, I think, is everything from pure data analysis to forecasting, reanalysis, and then basically that's disseminated to the downstream services for a number of regions, sub-regions, which you can see here, and I think the Mediterranean is one of them, and basically that then delivers to the member states, European users, end users, whatever you want to call them, and these can be government or private sector. So that's a high-level view, and even beyond national, but at the international level. In terms of the applications, well, I think by now you should have got a reasonably good idea about the applications. And this is an incomplete list, I have to stress. I'm sure that you can come up with many, many more examples, but it's safety of life at sea, search and rescue, security and protection of the marine environment or the health of the oceans, warning about coastal floods, water quality, storm impacts, harmful algae blooms, contaminants, etc., Then, of course, shipping, the straightforward thing, basically making forecasts available to be included in electronic charts, and ecosystem prediction, oil spills, maritime operations, and so on. So that's an endless list in terms of possible and potential applications. And this is really important to keep in mind. These are things happening on a daily and day-to-day basis. Even if you don't hear about it, but this is now very much happening and being used, these data, by many, many users in the maritime sector. Another example here is was started, in fact, although this is quite old paper, by one of my colleagues. So they basically started drawing on a number of ocean forecast products and basically used that to identify fishing zones, and therefore trying to, because fish, in this case tuna, prefer to stay close to front, and therefore knowing the frontal structure and being able to predict it, they can advise fishermen, for instance, in terms of the areas where they can go, the regulating agencies, and where they have to stay out, and therefore basically trying to manage the catch, and also basically telling the fishermen, well, if you go there, you can catch your fish easier and faster, rather than having to trawl much further. So it's basically the kind of compromise and the kind of balance one has to strike with these kind of forecasts between sustainability, in this case of living resources, but also providing assistance to fisheries. Now, this is sort of a bit of a jump now. When we started Godae OceanView in 2008, we sat back as a group, as a community, and said, well, let's step back a little bit from the typical technical issues I just mentioned a few minutes ago. So what is the rationale for continuing our work in ocean forecasting? And so we're looking really at it from an overarching perspective. And of course, you know, there's the Earth system, and there's still, I think, because of the special nature of this group and this effort in terms of high-resolution forecasting, we felt that it was important to provide advice to our colleagues who work in climate and decadal prediction, but also then more specifically, and highlighting here in the coastal modeling efforts, I think there was a real demand, increasing demand, for nearshore and coastal water analysis and forecasting as well. Again, keep in mind that was roughly 8 years ago or so. And we also then, of course, identified that there was a growing demand for the sustained exploitation of the seas, as I just mentioned in the particular example, but balancing, keeping that in mind. And then at the bottom here, the traditional, I would say, applications in defense and search and rescue. And the other component here, of course, was that, and you're an example, there's an ongoing need to basically increase and extend our capabilities and capacities in the research and development, as particularly there's an ongoing push for coupling with other components of the Earth system, and I say this here in an overarching sense, not specifically, you know, the ocean forecasting, but for instance, in the climate domain, there's now more and more a need to link it with ecosystems, human activities, etc. And so we can play as a group, a small part in this. And of course, this can be done, as we said earlier, and only be done in collaboration with our partners, and therefore enhance the accuracy, for instance, of ocean products. And the last one, which is very important as well, because but it's easy to forget about, it's this two-way communication between, say, observing system agencies, including satellite agencies, and the ocean forecasting community. Because on the one hand, you know, the ocean forecasting really depends on products such as altimetry. On the other hand, the space agencies come to us and say, hey, can you please give us some evidence of the usefulness of the satellites we put in space? Because they then need to go back to governments and other funding bodies and use that as an argument in support of maintaining and building the observing system. So again, the Godae OceanView group tries to assist in these efforts, and I come back to that. Now, so with these 4 slides in mind, We then decided as an international community that we needed to continue the efforts originally undertaken by Godae, and I just remind you, this is the same slide I showed this morning, that Godae was basically about demonstrating the feasibility and utility of real-time global operational oceanography. So that was achieved, and I think the community and the users and funding bodies ticked off on that in 2008. But then, as I just showed you on these other 4 slides, there was a unanimous agreement that there was an ongoing need for a group similar to Godae, but not identical, in terms of continuing to lead the scientific development and implementation of forecasting systems, and therefore improving the accuracy and utility of those systems. But also increasingly promoting, and as I showed you in the case, for instance, of Copernicus, promoting the development of downstream use of ocean data and information products. There are other links, again, with intergovernmental bodies. I won't go into the details here, but we work very closely together with international bodies like the Joint Technical Committee on Oceanography and Marine Meteorology, which is part of the World Meteorological Organization and the Intergovernmental Oceanographic Commission. You don't have to remember that. It's just a technical detail, but again, it demonstrates our association and the way we are embedded in the international research domain. You've seen a very similar slide this morning, just showing you the countries involved in ocean forecasting. South Africa, at the moment, is emerging as another operational oceanography forecasting country. So I understand they are just about to make a commitment for an operational system. At the moment, they are observers, as far as I recall, for or in Godae OceanView. But again, this is a global effort, as you can see. Yes. They are at least basin scale, not necessarily all global. We have Indian colleagues here, and I think we have, as an example, the Indian colleagues run a basin scale model. And the same applies, to the best of my knowledge, at least in the scales, to the other systems as well. So it's at least a basin scale. Okay, no, very briefly, although you can guess it, who are the members of Godae OceanView? They're typically leading scientists involved in developing operational oceanography in their country. Obviously, you should have some skills in that area. And at the same time, of course, there has to be a commitment, and that's very important, by your country, by your Met agency, operational agency, you name it, to have a sustained development and sustained operational system in place. So if you basically develop an operational system or a forecasting system at home, you're probably not likely to be regarded as an operational system. So that's very important. There has to be official commitment by your country or by the relevant agencies in your country. And of course, these people are supposed to have some flexibility in terms of capacity to make decisions. I don't want to bother you with, again, with structures, but I think it is quite important to give you an idea how Godae OceanView has been working and operating in the last 8 or 9 years. So there are about, as I might have mentioned, around 30 members representing these countries I just showed to you. But there's also a patrons group. So this is the group basically which provides some funding for the operation of the office, but they also, more importantly, are really the group which represents the stakeholders, the users. So they are members, senior members, executives, say, of forecasting centers or similar, and therefore they have access to very senior, typically government representatives in support of and can lobby in support of ocean forecasting. More importantly, perhaps for you, and in fact for us as scientists, is this range of task teams. And as you can see at the bottom, task teams address specific topics of particular importance to Godae OceanView, scientific topics, but they all require collaboration with international research programs or other groups. So none of them is just a single country. All of them have international collaboration. And as you can guess, this is what I call where the real work happens in Godae OceanView. It's not here. The real work happens in terms of the scientific progress, achieving scientific progress happens really within these task groups or task teams. The one is intercomparison and validation, so they look basically at comparing various systems from these international systems and drawing conclusions about how to improve the forecast system. Then there's the observing system evaluation task team. So they look basically at how observations impact the forecast skill, but they also provide potentially at least observing impact statements, which means when you withhold, say, in a particular piece of observation, say you do a forecast, you have a forecasting system and you don't assimilate altimetry, then that tells you something in a test case at least, how valuable altimetry is and how much, for instance, the error deteriorates if you wouldn't assimilate altimetry. So this is the kind of work undertaken by this team. The Coastal Ocean and Shelf Seas task team, I think, is the largest one. They really draw heavily they heavily work on issues and challenges associated with coastal and shelf seas modeling, which is the boundary conditions and all the things typical for coastal modeling systems and forecasting systems. Marine ecosystems and analysis prediction task team, as the name suggests, this is the team which really looks at improving biogeochemical and eventually even ecosystem forecasting capability and get it up to a level where the physical forecasting got to. And then the coupled one, and I have a few more slides about the coupled prediction in a minute, but again, I think it's fair to say that many forecasting centers see the future in atmospheric and ocean and other component prediction in this area, in coupled prediction, for a number of reasons, and therefore that's an important one at least as well. And then this one here, data assimilation. Well, I talked about it earlier. There are lots of things that need to be improved and to be explored in terms of the options in data assimilation. So the totality of this really forms the totality of these 6 task teams form the basis for the kind of scientific work, the improvements, etc. I highlighted earlier in my slides. Some progress has been made, and I will be quickly here with these slides. Certainly there has been a consolidation of international leadership in Godae OceanView in the last few years, but there's, as always, room for improvement. The task teams I showed you here, coupled, and I think the ecosystem one and also the data assimilation one are rather recent ones and rather new, so that has been achieved as well, and communication with international research bodies too. And the final slide about the achievements. This is an ongoing job, as I said, the task hasn't been accomplished yet. It's about providing documents and recommendations to observational agencies. Keyword here again, for instance, satellite altimetry and space agencies. Assess the impact of observations. Intercomparisons in a robust and operational environment have happened at 5 centers in the past. And also the, as I said earlier, the coastal task team is very much looking at the improvements to nested modeling capabilities, both in regional and purely coastal, which is then another scale down. Or up, depending on how you define it. And also the champions then we have in the ecosystem task team for biological observations. And some progress, not too much, but I think some progress has also been made in the coupled atmosphere, ocean, ice, waves community and prediction. Now, this is the slide I have to warn you. Again, don't look at any details. I won't go through all these acronyms. It's just highlighting what I said earlier, that in this circle, you see the task teams, etc., and the Godae OceanView, basically science team, and we are connected to many other international bodies, and that basically then links back also the members of Godae OceanView. These are basically where the people on Godae OceanView come from in terms of their home agencies, and that basically through GOVST are then connected into this international domain. Many of these groups are governmental or intergovernmental panels. And I'll leave it there. Now, moving on, and now going back to the science, Just a few words about trends and future developments. And again, this is important to remember. This is an incomplete list, but it just highlights to you a few challenges. In ocean modeling, and I take very much here the pragmatic view, there are still, I think, ongoing issues regarding how to, and we heard it earlier this morning from Bela, in terms of how to parameterize certain unresolved processes. So for instance, diapycnal diffusion and mesoscale eddying models related to viscosity and diffusivity coefficients, if you want to put it that way. Submesoscale fronts, we heard a lot about it this morning. If you basically look at the current situation, I think there's still some issues even in the coarser models, eddy resolving, but not submesoscale or mesoscale, submesoscale resolving, sorry. Representation of ocean floor and bathymetry, it's also model dependent and could be to some extent improved to improve forecast accuracy, particularly over silts and other things, shallow areas. And as I said, the large-scale ocean waves atmosphere sea ice coupling, of course, is also of key interest to the climate community. So there are some synergies here and also some kind of collaboration happening, noting, of course, that the forecasting community, the short-term forecasting community, has a need for much higher resolution. And then, last but not least, under modeling, the coupling between physical, biogeochemical, and ecosystem models. I think it's one of the big challenges ahead of the community, not just Godae OceanView, but really the Earth system modeling community. Observing systems, I think as new observing systems come on board, and for instance gliders are being used more frequently, there's a need for exploring the impact of these types on a regional, global, whatever scale you prefer. It's happening already, I'm aware of that, but I think there's room for better coordination. Then the next one, again, observing system in the case of biogeochemical and ecosystems. We all know it's incomplete, so there are various international bodies working on it, on improving it, but it's a long-term goal. And then related to observing systems in general, it's the design and of observing systems and its analog of adaptive sampling. I mean, there are only limited resources available, so the question then is, again, to be answered by the science community, where should the money be spent for the observing system, or is there an option basically through adaptive sampling, through basically feedback between the models, the forecasting systems, and the observations to inform where certain observations should be gathered. So that's another, I think, ongoing challenge. In terms of data assimilation, I mentioned coupled modeling. I think there's a challenge in terms of data assimilation. Similarly, I mentioned modeling in the biogeochemical and ecosystem domain. That's another challenge. Representation of model and data errors using ensembles, which are very much, I'm tempted to say, dominating the scientific interest, the ensemble methods, I mean. But nevertheless, how to represent errors in this context are still a challenge. And then multi-scale data assimilation and estimation of interior and open boundary conditions or solutions in nested systems. I think there are systems, numerous systems, which have solved it, but I think it's still quite specific. And then moving to the coastal ocean, I think the products available to constrain coastal models like satellite and in situ observations, I think that's an active area of research. Coastal ocean forecasting systems that downscale and upscale, the two-way nesting or coupling, has also in some cases successfully been demonstrated, but I would say not necessarily globally been implemented. And then again, similar to what I said about adaptive sampling a minute ago, it's the objective design of observing systems for the coastal ocean. Just a few words about Earth system modeling or fully coupled modeling, whatever you want to call it. And I quote again Michelle Riniker from 2010 from OceanOps 09, where she said that a physical biogeochemical ocean model that couples, the atmosphere, sea ice, land surfaces, etc., is quite promising, and that's certainly still the belief of the vast majority of the science community, particularly as it would enable some kind of seamless system interaction rather than having just components for the ocean, for the atmosphere, etc. But it requires new approaches, for instance, in data assimilation. but it's obvious from preliminary research that basically the benefits from coupled systems, and I'm just using here a test case provided by our colleague, one of our colleagues from the Bureau of Meteorology for tropical cyclone forecasting in Australia. But the benefits are quite obvious. If you look at not this particular animation, but the details, you can clearly see benefits to be derived from coupled forecasting in terms of higher accuracy and reliability of the forecast. Coupled data assimilation, of course, comes with coupled modeling. I think there are efforts underway, and certainly numerous test cases have been run, but so far, or as far as I know, the majority of coupled systems that use data assimilation still do it very much in a single mode, or where only in a sort of reduced mode, where particular emphasis is given, say, to the ocean model data assimilation, but not necessarily holistically to all components. But I'm happy to be told otherwise. And the challenge, of course, here is that if you do data assimilation in a fully coupled system, there's a high risk that you have rapidly growing modes, particularly in the atmosphere, which then, in quotes, spoil your whole forecast or your whole forecast system. What it really means is basically, if you've got here a simple diagram, you have ocean temperature somewhere at a certain level, and that ocean temperature at a particular point can influence your whatever velocity or in the atmosphere at a point not too far away within the decorrelation scales, etc. But it's this kind of idea that really is behind coupled prediction. So you no longer just look at the ocean, you look at all the components ideally, but in this case, this example, it's just ocean and atmosphere, but it's really how you simultaneously optimize the atmosphere and the ocean based on the observations you have available. There are some benefits, as I said, generally speaking, but more specifically, you can actually close some of the flux errors, momentum, heat, and mass at the boundary particularly by tuning in a coupled system the parameterizations. So that then affects basically surface current, waves, etc. Everything that's at the ocean atmosphere boundary layer, and that's also expressed at the points down here. So again, it's the interaction at this interface which can significantly, theoretically at least, be improved by coupled prediction. Here's a simple example which I think was done in 2008. So they basically had a coupled system and did some optimization of the bulk coefficients for the heat fluxes. And you can see here the observations. This is from two systems which, at least at that time, didn't have an optimization process for the bulk coefficients from NSAP and from European Center. And here is the coupled 40 VAR data assimilation. And as you can see, when you compare these plots, that this one, by and large at least, certainly comes closer to the observations than the other two systems. So that's it's not a fully coupled system, again, but it's an example of how things can be improved. So to summarize, and again, just from a very high level, I think operational oceanography has a very broad definition, as I said to you earlier, and hopefully I've been able to give you at least a flavor of what operational oceanography is about. It's still a very young discipline of science relative to weather forecasting, so we're still learning a lot from our colleagues in weather forecasting. Nevertheless, operational oceanography has many products and applications, and it's growing. Key stakeholders increasingly, I think, get involved in not just demanding outputs and products, but actually also providing ongoing and sustained funding for this kind of effort. And that's the only way forward in terms of improving some of the problems we are still facing. It's a national, international endeavor, as I showed you with these funny org charts. And then it's all based on partnerships and collaboration. There is no single country who has got the capacity and capability to solve all the science questions ahead. And ultimately, as I said before, and we shouldn't forget it, unlike pure bench-top science, there's a clear driver here, and that is to provide societal and or economic benefits. So, in concluding, I thought I'd show you a few publications which you might find interesting. So this is from the first summer school, basically with Eric and Jacques as editors. So that book was published in 2006. I'm not even sure if it's still available, is it? It is. Then following on, Gary Brassington, I edited the book following on from the summer school in Perth in 2010. And then I think the most up-to-date account of operational oceanography and where the community stands in terms of the status, the science, challenges, etc. You can find, in fact, in two quite recent issues, or volumes, I should say, of the Journal of Operational Oceanography. So they were published in 2015 as basically after the 2013 Godae OceanView Symposium. And so this is the most up-to-date overarching account, putting aside individual publications, of course, a very comprehensive account of the status of international operational oceanography. So I would recommend, if you're really interested, have a look at this. And I think Baylor showed earlier this morning a book from Peter Miller about modeling, and I thought I should perhaps conclude here by pointing you to Stephen Griffith's book, although it's 2004, I think, but I think there's still some good stuff in it in terms of ocean models. So this is very general. This is about climate models, but obviously, you know, we're using the same foundation. So, and I should probably stop here. Thank you very much. Questions, please.
So with this international cooperation, how do you manage the governmental interest in protecting certain information versus the distribution of information?
Yes, and that is a very valid question, which, by the way, doesn't just apply to governments, but it applies to certain sectors of the private industry as well. Look, from my perspective, and I'm happy to ask the new co-chair of Godae OceanView if there have been any very recent developments, but from my perspective, it's an ongoing issue. I mean, it has, and without going into details and mentioning individual countries, agencies, etc., it has significantly improved in the last 10 years. But yes, there are still issues. But, well, if you talk about both two things, national security and also EEZs, exclusive economic zones. When you approach those, and that is true, by the way, not just for forecast products, but even for the observational products. So, for instance, for Argo floats, you know, they need to seek approval for the countries when they drift into a certain country. They need to, via diplomatic channels, they need to notify them. So that process, to the best of my knowledge, works reasonably well. But look, yes, I would be lying to you if I would say there are not any issues.
Yep.
Observations in from biogeochemistry.
Yep.
What you suggest for the future? Where could we improve observations to end up with better?
Number one, I'm not a biogeochemical oceanographer, despite the fact me talking about it. Number two, there is actually and forgive me, an international panel, the GOVST panel for biology, whatever it's called exactly. That part of the global ocean observing system has the task of doing exactly that, planning for improving the amount of data, the quality of biogeochemical data. We already see an improvement compared to a few years ago. Many of you will be aware that the latest generation of Argo floats now has the capability of also measuring oxygen, I think some of the nutrients, and you might know better than I do. So that will certainly help, if and when implemented, to increase the data density with regard to biogeochemical observations, I should say. But as always, as I said earlier, all observing systems come with a challenge. There's only a limited amount of money available, and it's, if you like it or not, it's all about, it's not all, but it's also about funding. If countries or agencies decide to heavily invest in biogeochemical observing systems. I think that would significantly improve the kind of forecast skills in biogeochemical modeling and forecasting. But as I said, it's a funding question as well. It's not necessarily a science question. I think that problem has been solved in terms of the need, but it's largely where well, first of all, maintaining the physical observing system is, I think, pretty much a no-brainer. But then how you build on that and add another, i.e. biogeochemical observing system beyond the existing one, I think that's largely a financial challenge.
Jacques?
Actually, a question to you. You have a view of the world operational oceanography. So is there a cultural dimension? Is there a difference between, for example, operational oceanography in Australia, in India, in China, in Europe?
Depends on what you mean. Difference. What do you mean?
I don't know, and the way the people are approaching science, or the use or application, or their social
well, I mean,
issues, or
I think. Well, I mean,
you
would have to ask. You would have to ask the other representatives here from other countries and agencies. Certainly, there are different drivers, and I mean, many have, and let's be quite blunt and clear here, defense as a key driver and stakeholder. But then in the private area, there's, I think, different emphasis, and I couldn't give you a simple answer to that. I think we really would have to talk about country by country. But I think it is along the lines of what I showed earlier. It's about the balance in the private sector, marine resources. It's all about striking the right balance in terms of exploitation of the marine resources, but also trying to protect. But where that exactly sits, country by country, I think that's where you have to talk to the individual representatives from the centers. And there's, from what I can say is there's certainly some differences. Yeah.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Andreas. So, Joaquin. Update.
Example.
Okay, so if you need to go to the bathroom, just go in and out. But I think we won't have much of a break this afternoon.
We have time before the break, right?
No, it's a break right now, but that's fine. I mean, it's only 10 minutes.
Because I think Andreas mentioned a local case, a local problem, which is related to the local operational. Thanks. Okay, no, wait a minute. I need 1 second. Oh, okay, thanks a lot. Wait a minute. That was really just improvised when I saw your slides, Andreas. And I think it's interesting that you all have a kind of an idea of practical application or things that happen around here. You know where you are. Or in principle, you should know we are here. That's the Bay of Piensa, okay, looking north. In front, you have Mallorca. That's this island, okay. And we go to a place which is here, which is Ciudadela. Beautiful place, if you can go. That's really fantastic. You see this harbor over here. Okay, it's really nice place. And as you see, it's almost a perfect rectangular. So it's really interesting. It's almost, okay, sorry, I can't see. Yeah, here. It's almost 1 kilometer long, 50 meters wide, and 5 meters depth. Okay? And one of the applications in operational oceanography that Andreas was mentioning is meteo tsunamis. Meteo tsunamis and briefs. Brief is our meteo tsunami pre-operational system. And I'm not going to go into the details now. I just want you to see what one of those episodes in this harbor really looks like. And you'll see the importance of trying to model appropriately. That's in the middle of the harbor, you've seen, okay? And let me just move a little bit. What happens is that the harbor free mode of oscillations is 10 minutes. Okay, what happens then under certain conditions, which I'll go later, or at coffee break I can tell you, what happens is that in 10 minutes, the harbor completely empties, and then the water comes back. Okay, and then you see what happens. You see now the water going out. Okay, really the harbor completely empties, and then of course when in the next minutes the water comes back, and you'll see that in a minute. The different boats. So you see now this kind of almost a meter now below what we started some minutes ago. Okay, that continues. While it continues, I'm going to try to tell you a little bit about the process, and you probably will have some more information on Baptiste Moore presentation in a couple of days. What happens here is that you have some specific atmospheric conditions under which you have gravity waves in the atmosphere. Those gravity waves in the atmosphere trigger, of course, gravity waves in the ocean that when there are certain matching conditions between the atmospheric conditions, wave propagation, and the ocean wave propagation, together with the depth, root square of GH, remember, then there is a perfect resonance. And then there's a clear amplification there then of the wave in the open ocean, the wave over the shelf. In the open ocean, you would usually only have an inverse barometer effect. Okay, so 1 millibar in the atmosphere is 1 centimeter in the ocean. Then when you get amplification, this millibar in the atmosphere ends up becoming, or 2 or 3 millibars in the atmosphere, end up becoming even up to 60 centimeters at the mouth of this harbor. 60 centimeters at the mouth of the harbor implies 3 meters inside. And that's what you're seeing now. Now the water is coming back, as you see. Sorry for the coffee break. It's going to be a little shorter, but I think it's fantastic. And we are here in the middle of, and now you see, we start to see some problems. This poor sailing boat sailing alone. Okay, bye-bye. It's not going to be the only one. And you see, now the water starts to enter. It's more than 2 meters per second. Okay, that's another one who's going. Bye-bye. And what's really interesting is that if I have a minute, in a minute, what I can show you is on our website. You can look at the SOCIP website, and under forecasting facility, you have one specific issue which is called Risaga. That's the name of this event, this meteo tsunami in there. Now you look at this sailing boat. It enters. He's a pretty good sailor. He enters. He didn't realize where he was going when he enters, because when you're outside, you don't see anything. Now this guy sees, well, there's something really wrong here, so I better go out. Okay, and he succeeds. And you'll see in a minute also those fishing boats. You see this is going really fast. And then the sailing boat turns, or tries to turn. More boats coming in. The fishing boat now is also off. Okay, so that's real operational oceanography at small scale, of course. We have, as Andreas was showing. So what is interesting is that in SOCIR website, you can find some animations, some YouTube examples, and actually the model running, and you can see, for example, the forecast for tomorrow. Okay, so I leave it here, and just well, since you mentioned that, and I didn't know you were going to do, I thought this is a nice example of local, real, operational oceanography at small scale. And this happens, this kind of risaga happen almost every year, but not under those very exceptional conditions. Exceptional conditions like this is around once every 10 years. Oh, that's, okay, bad. Really, really bad. 40, 50, 1 hour. 40, 50 minutes, 1 hour. That's basically one of the results of the last papers by Baptiste and co-workers, because the maximum amplification takes place actually from Mallorca to Menorca, so in the channel. That's where the matching conditions, the 80 meters depth match the velocity, and so really it's very short time. However, one interesting thing in the harbor is that the locals know well the conditions when this happens. There are some very clear atmospheric conditions when those events happen. So actually the fishermen there and the people there, they say that there is the weather looks like risaga. So they know that under some atmospheric conditions, which I can tell you later, etc., there are the gravity waves in the atmosphere that generate this. So thanks very much, and coffee break.